All right, now we're joined by Omar Vasquez, who's running for school board position 5, correct?
You got it.
All right, so let's start with a 2-minute introduction.
Hi, my name is Omar Vasquez, and I'm running for Seattle School Board Position 5. I'm a lifelong progressive Democrat, and I've got over a decade experience in education and working with students, both as a teacher and a lawyer. I am running for the school board to offer my experience in education and my experience in the law and finance to work for the district, our schools, and our students. For 6 years, I was a high school math teacher at a large public high school. I worked with predominantly low-income students and students of color, and many of those students came to me several years behind grade level. So I worked with those students to get them caught up on pace and onto top colleges and universities. I built an AP Calculus program from the ground up at my school, resulting in hundreds of students having access to challenging content. And based on my work, I was promoted to department chair, a position which I held for 2 years. I left teaching to go to law school, but I continued to work in education. For example, I initiated a partnership between my law school and 2 high schools to arrange for students to come and attend oral arguments by the Ninth Circuit, and I personally instructed those students in substantive and procedural legal issues. I am currently a lawyer here in Seattle at Davis Wright Tremaine. I have a business and tax practice. I work on transactions ranging from $150,000 in consideration all the way up to $300 million. But I'm still doing the work of education. So for example, I have advised community-based organizations, education nonprofits. I've advised 2 immigrant refugee youth to secure their lawful permanent residency here. And last year I was on the Mayor's Education Advisory Council. The school board is going to have some pretty significant challenges in the next few years. We've got a McCleary budget that just rolled out. We've got a teacher contract that we're going to have to negotiate in the next year. We may or may not have to find a new superintendent, and we have to be on the ready for any attacks from the Trump-DeVos administration. So what the school board needs right now is a director with experience in education, with experience in the law, and with experience in education. My time is running out, but I'll briefly say that I'm endorsed by the current incumbent director, Dr. Stefan Blanford. He knows I have the experience to get the job done. I look forward to this discussion and having your support.
Great, so now we have our 4 prepared questions, and feel free to turn over the sheet in front of you so you can read along as we read them aloud. These are 2-minute answers, and Sophia, will you do number 1?
Number 1. If elected, would you maintain the Seattle Public Schools' current policy of opposing new charter schools in the district?
Yes, I would. I don't think there's any real reason for it. I don't think there's a need for SPS to be authorizing charter schools. So in this past week, I've been to several ribbon cuttings for new schools and new schools that have been developed in North Seattle. I've been to Olympic Hills. I've been to a Meany Middle School in my own backyard. And there's just, the district is perfectly capable of building schools that have excellent content, unique programming, that can address capacity issues. So there's really no reason for the district to cede to any kind of schools or any kind of private organizations that the district wouldn't have oversight over. So I commit to that.
Brittany, number 2.
Seattle Public Schools has warned that the legislature's recently adopted education funding plan will leave them millions of dollars in deficit, including as much as $40 million short in special education. As a board member, how would you address this issue?
Yeah, when I was first got into this race, everybody I spoke to pre-McCleary budget suggested that we would have a shortfall between $75 million and $150 million. And on a budget on an operating budget of about $750 million, that's pretty significant, right? It's unclear to me, and I've spoken to a lot of people on this, what the size of the shortfall is going to be from the McCleary budget. There's a levy swap component. There are changes to the way we do teacher pay. There are changes to the way we do tri-pay, time responsibilities, incentives. There's a lot up in the air at the moment. What are we going to need to do? Well, I think the most important thing is it's because we don't know what the size of the shortfall is going to be. We're going to have to really take a deep dive into the budget. I'm going to have, as a director, I want to work with staff and with the chief financial officer, with Stephen Nielsen at the district to find out what are the programs that we absolutely want to preserve. We certainly want to make sure that teacher pay is protected as a teacher. I taught for 6 years. Every single year that I taught, my pay actually went down. And so that's a terrible thing to do to recruit and retain high quality educators, which is absolutely what we need. On the special education front, we know that the the Individual Disabilities Education Act requires that schools provide access to high quality education opportunities in the least restrictive environment. A lot of the schools that I visited, did some ribbon cuttings in this past couple of weeks, are built out wings such that it facilitates special education students being able to move into a mainstream environment, but also have opportunities for pull-out and support. We just have to continue to work with parents and work with teachers to provide good quality special ed services. I know as a teacher, one of the challenges is, when I was teaching, I had students with IEPs and with 504 plans, and a lot of the time it's difficult to differentiate or to make IEP meetings. So we're going to look to site leadership to be able to support teachers so they can provide good services to students with special needs.
Jason, number 3.
How do you propose to improve the district's capacity management planning to keep up with Seattle's growth?
Yeah, so a little context here. In the past decade, and I learned this talking to Larry Nyland, the superintendent, in the past decade, the school district has increased its population by 8,000 students. And what Dr. Nyland has said is that 8,000 students, there are something like 240 some odd districts in the state of Washington that have 8,000 students or fewer. So the school district has grown tremendously. We're growing at about 1,000 students a year. What do we need to do to address capacity? Well, we like I said, there's been 6 schools that just opened up this year. And those 6 schools have opened up hundreds of seats for students. So the thing that we need to do is engage in an audit of what is the capacity plan for the next decade. There is a plan in place to roll out new schools and open up new square footage and open up seats to address capacity issues. We never know what the precise rate is going to be, but there is a plan in place. Certainly, it's not going to be enough. We know that classes are overcrowded. I've heard of situations where elementary schools are having 28 students, on average in a classroom. Now, for a high school teacher like I was, a class of 28 is very manageable. For an elementary school, that's ridiculous for one teacher. So we certainly need to pay attention and make sure that we have the space available for students. We're able to reduce class sizes. It certainly will be challenging with limited funding, but we're going to do the best we can to be very efficient and wring out every dollar we can out of the budget.
Great. Sean, number 4.
What steps can you take as a member of the school board to work toward racial equity in our schools?
And so this is, one of my big passions. This is kind of what got me into education to begin with, especially as somebody who grew up on the wrong end of the achievement gap and going to schools in low-income communities. One of the things I've learned in my experience as an educator is that the academic achievement gap, the opportunity gap, is first and foremost a literacy gap. So low-income students will, before ever entering school, will have heard between 30 million and 50 million fewer words relative to their peers in wealthier communities. Now, those are not distinctly different words, right? Those are just different words. So before school's ever started, we already see a gap. Pre-K is helpful. As the city continues to expand its universal pre-K, I hope that we'll start to erode some of that initial gap. One of the things I learned, though, when I was on the Mayor's Education Advisory Council last year was that although early ed and pre-K will help to close the gap before students enter school, the problem is you lose a lot of those gains in elementary. Now, I was a high school teacher, and so elementary ed is admittedly not my forte, but I want to dive deeply into what's going on in elementary school. And something we did on the Mayor's Council was to look at what was going on in some of the schools that are working very well and continue to study what's going well and implement them on a broader scale so we can address the achievement gap early on. Now, there's a bunch of things to say about this. We also need to make sure that we have high expectations for low-income students and students of color. This is a persistent problem, and it's not just among white teachers, it's also among teachers of color. So we need to continue to address some implicit bias issues that result in students not having access to high-quality content. We need to continue to recruit very heavily for teachers that we have a diverse workforce that's reflective of the student population. We have a minority-majority district, but our teaching force does not reflect that student population. We've got to continue to look at disproportionate discipline and make sure that we're complying with our federal consent decree. There's so many other issues we're going to do on equity. This is a huge topic. This is why we're all in the business of education.
Great, so now we'll open up to follow-up questions. These are 1-minute answers. And Robert, we'll go first.
It's really hard to hear your answer on charter schools. There's a great article in the New York Times today about Michigan gambled on its charter schools and children lost. I know you serve on the board of a charter school organization, Summit, and they've opened a brand new school in West Seattle this year. Was that a mistake for them to open in Seattle? Should that not have happened? help me understand, you serve on the board, but yet they're opening new schools in the district.
Right. So here's what happened. So when I came to Seattle very early on, I was approached by leadership at Summit and asked to join their board. And they said, we have got a student population that is over 50% free and reduced lunch. We've got a student population where no more than 25% of the demographic is anyone race, ethnicity, nationality. And frankly, we need somebody with education experience, finance experience, leadership experience who can provide governance and oversight over our operations, over our public monies. And I expressed to them, I've got opinions on charter schools. I'll be candid with you and tell you what my opinions are, and we should decide if this is a good fit. And ultimately, I decided to join the board, knowing full well that if I ever decided to enter public service, this would be something that would be difficult for me. But I made that decision anyway because I did want to be a positive role model for students of color in those schools. I did want to provide my experience. And I have more to say. I see that the time is running out, but I would love to continue to engage on this point with you.
Sure, thank you.
How has being on the Summit Charter School Board informed your point of view when it comes to education policy?
One of the things that attracted me about Summit was their innovative approach to content and curriculum. So there's a slight shift away from content instruction to cognitive skill development. And that's something that's always resonated with me when I was an educator. I'm not an old person, but when I was in high school, we did not have the internet, right? Maybe a dial-up junior, senior year. But all the content now is on phones. We have Wi-Fi in school, so we need to focus on teaching students research skills so that way they can become lifelong learners. We need to focus on teaching students financial literacy skills because we live in a startup hub. You should know some basic finance and some basic accounting. We should be teaching students constitutional law and civics because you should not have to go to law school like I did in order to understand the scope of your First Amendment rights, Fourth Amendment rights, Fifth Amendment rights. So working at Summit allowed me to see what an innovative model can look like. It certainly is something that we can implement in the Seattle Public School District as well.
Sophia and then Clayton.
So there was an article in the Seattle Times, I think last weekend, about freshman high school failure rates and looking at closing the gap at that year. And it was sort of a shocking chart to see the failure rate of Native and Hawaiian Pacific Islander. Half of the students fail at least one course. Have you looked at or considered any way to particularly address this community that seems to be getting left behind?
Yeah, and that article went on to say that students who fail, I think it's one or more courses in freshman year, have, I don't remember what the stat is, but a substantially lower likelihood of graduating from high school. So if we really want to address high school rates, which are pretty staggering, right? I think one statistic I have handy right now is over 40% of Black and Latino students in our district will not graduate from Seattle high schools on time or at all. So what do we need to do? We need to make sure that now that we've identified this issue, as a school board director, I want to work with the executive directors at the district level who oversee the principals at the various schools. I want to do a deep dive in the data and see which schools are we having the largest problems with. What interventions are we engaging in currently? What's working, what's not working? We know that there's a huge opportunity gap at the high school level, but we know that teachers can make many years of gain with high expectations and challenging content. And so we just need to make sure that we are implementing those issues and the same issues I mentioned in my equity answer to make sure students don't fail freshman year classes.
Clayton.
Hi again.
I have a question. It's difficult for me to articulate as usual, Jeff would say. So I'll give it to you as a quote. Both of my sons went to Summit. One of them offered the following question to my ears when he entered 9th grade at Roosevelt. You sent me to Summit, Dad. Now I'm at Roosevelt, and I'm not ready. Why? So I asked this in the context of the role of Summit School as being, through the years, a kind of public charter school. It's a kind of test case. And I'd like to hear your comments.
I'm a little confused by the question. Summit Schools in Seattle is a 9th, 10th, and 11th grade at the moment. It sounds like your son or grandson, was it son or grandson?
Thanks, but thank you. I'm not dead yet. Or at least buried.
I'm trying to take your question very seriously. Yeah.
I do have a grandson,
Okay.
and my grandson is 8, almost.
Uh-huh.
It was my son, and the year was something like 1995, and Summit was a K-12 program in those days.
It was one of the alternative schools,
That's right, yeah.
not a charter, it's a public, it was a public school.
That's
Yeah,
right.
that seems unrelated to the summit. Yeah, that I've worked with. Nonetheless, to your point, there are, like we just mentioned in the previous question, a lot of students, and when I was a teacher, a lot of students enter 9th grade unprepared for the realities of high school, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the reasons that I've observed when I was teaching is a lot of the feeder middle schools don't have aligned curriculum. And so when they get to the high school level, you have students then sitting in one class who all have various levels of ability in any particular given subject. And so it's the teacher's duty now to diagnose students' abilities, differentiate content, and get everybody to a point where they've demonstrated mastery of content by the end of the year. And that's very challenging for teachers. So I expect that this is maybe at least somewhat related to the experience you had, but I'd be interested in learning more.
We have time for a few more questions.
So I just wanted to get clarification from you on number 2. You talked about diving into the budget. And can you clarify what you meant by that? 'Cause
Sure.
from my perspective, it kind of sounded like, let's look at the programs and see where we can trim. So can you talk more about that?
I hope not to trim anything.
Okay.
The reality is the district can't run a deficit. We know that staff pay, teacher pay is on a contract, and there's another year left on the contract. So that money is committed. So we need to look at what's the remaining amount of money that we have available. And we have to look at programming. And one of the, it's difficult for me to tell you right now precisely what programs are going to be funded and which ones are not. What I can tell you is what my values are. And what one of my values is you look at a program that has a history of success, working well with students, and it's loved in the community, and we're going to try to protect that program. But it's hard to know at this stage when everybody I've asked, nobody has a clear answer on what the amount of money is going to be coming from Olympia based on this upcoming budget. So it's an open question.
Final question, Ben.
So statistically speaking, women are pretty ill represented in the tech world these days, and the education of women for tech has been kind of a boys' club, and many don't feel welcome there. What will you do in the Seattle school district to encourage women to learn how to get into this market that's so valuable and get out of school?
That's a great question. I think what I would want to do is find champions in the district. I mean, as a director, I mean, my obligation, I mean, the role of a director, right, is to oversee the superintendent, manage budgets, provide a conduit for the community to access leadership in the district. So what I would want to do is find champions in the district who are working on this issue and see what they need for support and provide it to them, because this is critically important that STEM is not representative on a gender level or on a racial level. So I know I'm convinced that there are teachers who are doing the good work of trying to heavily recruit female students into coding classes or STEM-related classes and make sure that they remain in these classes. You know, one thing I've heard, and I'll say this briefly, is when female students don't do well in a STEM class, typically the instinct is to leave because I'm not good at it. Whereas when male students don't do well in a STEM class, they say, I'll just do better next year. There's some research that suggests this. So we need to combat that mindset and work really hard to retain females in STEM-related classes.
So we are out of time. If you want to take 30 seconds for a closing statement.
I'm going to flip the page here. So, you know, I guess I'll close by saying this. One of the reasons why I have committed much of my professional and civic life to education is because I grew up as the son of an immigrant, and I did not have great schools coming up. I am very fortunate to have the life I live now, but I attribute it to some pretty key interventions from very caring adults. And so I sincerely believe that it is my duty to contribute my skills and experience to make sure I put down ladders of opportunity for others. And that's one of the reasons why I'm running for school board. I think the school board needs somebody with experience. I think I have that experience, and I hope to have your support.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.